everyone. Welcome to another live stream organized by Students for Liberty. Today we'll have Ronald Bailey as our guest and we'll talk about the power of the free market, how it supports the environment and fuels innovation. You might understand that this is a kind of an uncommon topic in the liberty movement, precisely because the environmental protection has mostly been understood from of governmental help or subsidies or regulations, but we are aiming to change that. So, Students for Liberty is the largest pro-liberty student organizations in the world, and we're talking about in terms of leaders, events, and the countries represented. And April is actually a special month for us, firstly because it is the Green Liberty Month, which means we'll have talks and live events dedicated to free market environmentalism, but also because our very important and international event, LibertyCon Europe, is happening. So, in case any of you is in Portugal or you're around, make sure that you join LibertyCon happening on 22 and 23rd of April in Lisbon, the capital of Portugal. So, also make sure that you follow us on social media so that you can hear more about our events and our live streams. And today, actually, we will also appreciate your participation. As you can see, you can write your questions in the chat and we will answer all of them. I'd also like to introduce myself in case some of you might have seen me from SFL's social media accounts. I'm the TikTok associate Leila Tagieva, working for Students for Liberty. And another SFLer is joining us today, my dear co-host Marcin. He is a free market environmentalism program manager at Students for Liberty. And Martin is a nonprofit management specialist, campaign strategist, and policy analyst. With over 7 years of experience, he has established himself as a well-versed leader, and he's been speaking at many events, working on successful campaign and organized events with thousands of total attendees. And a little bit about our guest. Ronald Bailey is a science journalist and author who is currently working for the Reason magazine. He holds a bachelor degree from University of Virginia on philosophy and economics, and he actually began his career at Forbes magazine, where he wrote about business and economics. And in the early 90s, he became interested in environmental issues and shifted his focus on science journalism. Today he's here with us, as we already mentioned, to talk about power of free market in environmental protection and how it fuels innovation. So a little bit introduction before we start. So what is this Green Liberty Month about, and what is our aim here? What are we discussing today? Most people can agree this is kind of like the consensus that people from different political spectrums can agree on, at least to some degree, is that environmental is important and it is something that we have the responsibility to protect. But the debate is more about how can we protect the environment, and ethically it usually centers around various carrot and stick methods, but it's also about whether our environmental goals are consistent with our other goals, such as liberty in the case of us. So, for many years, capitalism has been isolated as the culprit behind environmental degradation, with many countries building their regulatory frameworks around that and activists leaning towards the left. However, as we have seen in recent interview with world-renowned musician and philanthropist Bono, this mood is changing. I'm quoting, I ended up as an activist in a very different place from where I started. I thought that if we just redistributed resources that we could solve every problem. Now I know that it is not true. There's a funny moment when you realize that as an activist, the off-ramp time of extreme poverty is entrepreneurial capitalism. So we will discuss how we can realign our environmental policies and our society around these goals to use capitalism as a vehicle for saving our planet. So, welcome again, our guest, Ronald Bailey, and what do you have to say?
I'm delighted to be with you. I'm eager to join the conversation and see how we can explain how capitalism actually is the way that we move to a clean and freer world.
Great to hear that. So, Marcin, would you like to introduce yourself once again?
Absolutely, absolutely. So thank you to both of you, and thank you, Leila, for this wonderful introduction. As Leila said, I'm the Free Market Environmentalism Program Manager, and I've been in the movement for quite a few years. I've been doing it in Europe, and now I'm doing it in North America, but also globally, thanks to Students for Liberty. I'm very glad that as the Liberty Movement, we are finally joining the conversation and becoming more prevalent in the discourse. I hope that this conversation can contribute to that as well. Awesome. So speaking of that, speaking of what you mentioned, Leila, a bit earlier, I like to assume that when it comes to environmental regulations, when it comes to environmental policy, that there's a positive intent behind them. That they, even if the policy is not good or has bad consequences, the people behind them tried to do something for the best that they hope that would actually be good. However, that doesn't mean that the actual outcomes are good. And so I think that's what I would like for us to focus in the conversation, rather than analyzing the intent behind a policy, rather to think about how we can align the outcomes to be in the way that we want them to be, and how to make policy that works. And so, starting off with what doesn't work, we have seen that sometimes, as for example in the case of, some of you may know, a policy by the Bush administration, there was an attempt to encourage the use of fuels that are made from biofuels, basically, so from corn. And the goal, it seemed intuitive, to, hey, if we introduce biofuels, that means that we are using less fossil fuels, which are dirtier, and because of that, it's going to be more environmentally friendly, right? Well, no, in the end, unfortunately, because that had a lot of perverse incentives on one end. It led to an oversupply on one end, and the redirection of the agricultural processes in that direction, which then contributed to a lot of pollution, soil degradation, and land use that was not efficient. Turned out that it might not be as good for the environment to do something that seems to be good for the environment.
Right.
And so, in the very fast cycle of policy, and with a lot of interest groups lobbying involved in showing that, hey, this policy, this subsidy, this regulation is good and it's going to be great for the environment, and with the snapshot journalism that is happening right now, I wanted to ask you, Ron, how can we step above that and basically make policy that is good scientifically, that has a good impact, that we can have the time to consider the possible outcomes, even if they might not be as good as we
Right.
intended them to be.
Well, if I may, what I would like to do is start with a larger framing idea that I am going to maintain, and I've been arguing this for a while, and some of my colleagues don't agree with this, but I want to suggest to you and all the listeners out there that whenever any one of you sees what you consider to be an environmental problem, whatever it may be, pollution, for example, is the chief one. That is occurring in an open access commons. In other words, it's occurring in an area of the world where there are no determined property rights. So if a forest is being deforested, like in the Amazon, it's largely because they're not private owners. If they're state owners, and they have different motivations. Or if a river is polluted, it's because they're not owners of the river, private owners of the river. If fisheries are overfished, and they almost all are, it's because, once again, the fishers don't have rights to the fish. And so so whenever you see an environmental problem, you think first of all that it's happening in an open access commons. Now, of course, the global atmosphere is the possible, along with the oceans, are the largest open access commons, and we'll be dealing with those later, I think. But so if you have an open access commons, there are basically three things you can do. when you identify a problem. Of course, as a libertarian, and I think there are good policy reasons for this, your first step should be to try to privatize it. That is to assign someone the ownership rights so that they will have the incentive to take care of the resource. And in the countries where you have a lot of private rights and so forth, what you do find is that pollution is abating and that kind of thing. The other thing you could do is regulation, because, and this seems to be the default policy of a lot of people when they first encounter an excess commons and they encounter pollution occurring in there, is, oh my God, the government must do something about this. And whenever the government does it, it becomes a political process. You have winners, losers. It becomes really hard to set the right level, if you will, of whatever the trade-offs are. And the third thing you could do is ignore it. And that obviously has a lot of downsides with that respect as well. So part of the reason the biofuels policy was adopted in the United States was initially an effort to try to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The idea is you plant corn, takes carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, you put it into cars, they put it back up, and then it comes back down into the corn. So, and as you mentioned, there are huge numbers of side effects that were not accounted for, again, because government policies are terrible at anticipating these things. So in the United States, it's really amazing, actually, that 45% of our corn crop is made into biofuels. If we were not making biofuels in some sense, or of course, other people would be planting corn for other reasons, feed for animals, that kind of thing. But think about it this way. If that 45%, that the amount of land in the United States, just did the calculation that is being plowed up for biofuels, is the amount of land that is the same size as our state of Florida in the United States. That's crazy. A new study out to proceed the National Academy of Sciences actually says when you take into account the fossil fuels used for fertilizer, the tractors, the amount of carbon dioxide, the amount of carbon that is released from plowing and so forth, biofuels actually produce more carbon dioxide or release more carbon dioxide into the atmosphere than using gasoline. A totally ridiculous side effect. And again, once again, not anticipated because the government had this really great idea they were going to do this. And one final factor is that obviously if you're plowing up land to make fuel, then you're not making food. One way to think about this is that it takes 450 pounds of corn to make 25 gallons, if you will, of ethanol to go into the tank of an SUV. 450 pounds, the calories of 450 pounds of corn would feed a person for a year. Not that they would eat that, but I'm just saying notionally, again, you can see how the trade-off between calories and fuel operates. So it's been a disastrous policy. How to unravel it? The politics are amazing. In the United States, again, I don't know how it works in other countries, so I suspect that once you have a constituency that's being subsidized in this way, it's going to be extremely hard to unravel it. In the United States, there are basically 12 states with 24 senators who the farm lobby can basically get them to vote the way they want. And that's a huge roadblock for unraveling this particular policy. Again, I have to say, one of the things that should be thought about and should be remembered is that initially a lot of members of the official, if you will, the environmental movement at the time were very much in favor of biofuels. And they were pushing this policy, and the Bush administration, when they adopted it, was like, wait, we have the environmentalists and the farmers on our side. It's a win-win politically for them. Turns out it was a loss for both the environmental movement and the environment in the long run.
Yeah, definitely. Very, very good points. And I like that you started to talk also a bit about political feasibility, because I think that's a topic that we, as libertarians, as classical liberals, often omit, because we like our graphs, we like our think tanks, and to think that, oh, if we can only give enough data, it's suddenly going to change everything. Well, it's not the case. It has to be politically feasible because politicians have to be re-elected.
Right.
And I think...
No, if I may, one of the problem once you've set up this particular system, and unraveling it will take a long time. One possible way to do this would be, and it's not the optimal way, it's not the libertarian way, is once the farmers are now hooked on subsidies, and they're going to vote for the subsidies. So what are you going to do? Possibly what you could do is to offer them conservation subsidies. Basically, take your land out of production of corn and allow it to go fallow and return wild land, plowed up lands to nature. And slowly but surely over time, you might be able to unravel this bad policy. But that's politics, and I think we all know here as libertarians what the right thing to do would be, which is to completely end this subsidy. In fact, we should end all subsidies. And but I don't know politically how feasible that would be. So the way to do it might be to develop a subsidy that would be pro-nature in some sense, that is allowing the land to return to nature and basically, if you will, paying off the farmers to stop plowing down the land.
Very good point, and I completely agree. To paraphrase Benjamin Franklin, the only thing certain in life are death, taxes, and corn subsidies. But to tie it to what you're saying, and also going back a bit with what you mentioned with privatization and considering the impact, a bit of a tragedy of the common situation as well. We started now talking a bit about incentives and to align them in a way that is on one side economically beneficial and on the other environmentally beneficial. And I wanted to ask you if you could go a bit deeper into that. How can we? So let's assume we agree that in an ideal world there are no subsidies. We are all, working
Right.
together in a uncapped perfect system, etc., etc. But it's not the reality. It's not going to happen. How can we, with the current structures, with the current incentives, the way that they work, the way that the expectations are, in that the farmers want their money, they want their subsistence, at least for the time being. And the same thing goes for every other industry in the US. How
Right.
can we make the incentives better? How can we make the regulations better? Like, for example, is it instead of hoping that we get rid of all regulations, switching from prescriptive to descriptive regulations, for
Right.
example? Does it make sense for us to use that as like the first step to change the incentives so that we don't waste money, don't waste resources? But if we have to do them, let's do them properly.
Yes, I think that there are ways to do that. One intriguing proposal that Rod Richardson and Jigar Shah, and Rod is the head of Clean Capitalism Leadership Council, is a proposal, what they call a clean asset bonds and loans, where basically, it's a bit complicated, but the idea is that instead of subsidies, is that you would offer tax-free bonds for descriptive projects. For example, you would say what we want are low carbon or no carbon energy projects. And you could go to the market, the private markets, and say, all right, I now have these bonds, and you won't have to pay taxes on the income from those bonds when we pay them off. And they've done the calculations that basically this would be, if you will, they call tax subsidies in some sense or other, but it'd be much cheaper than the current tax rebates and so forth that we do for wind and solar in the United States. And once again, they would not be telling people what technologies to adopt. They would say, you show us that it would be no carbon or low carbon, you get access to the bond market in this way. And their argument is that once these industries start producing their energy and so forth, they'll be taxed on the other side, and actually you will make more tax money that way than the current system we have again of clean tax subsidies for wind and solar at this point. And I think that's a pretty intriguing idea.
So, taking it from the negative incentive, actually, I'd like to shift the discussion more to the perspective of taxes, and particularly a carbon tax, which is like all taxes, it imposes costs on the economy. And as we all know, these costs include like higher home energy costs, production costs, economic growth is like definitely harmed, and also the living standards are going down. And these are all the things that hurt low income families the most. And this is a negative incentive. But rather, I feel like we could focus on more positive incentives that can promote innovation. So this is kind of like an
Right.
alternative that actually incentivizes the nature of the how business works and how human nature works, instead of the punishing behavior. And an example would be providing tax cuts to businesses who demonstrate low emission innovation
Right.
technologies that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So, on this note, I would like to ask, is there a better way to internalize all these negative externalities? And if so, can you tell us more about how other positive incentives in the free market can encourage development of these eco-friendly technologies? And are we seeing this anywhere in the world?
Um, I have to be honest with you. I don't see a large movement in that direction. Again, when I was describing these clean asset bonds and loans, that would be certainly a definite way to go. They have not yet been adopted, but I do think that they would appeal to both free marketers and to people who are in the more traditional environmental movement. So I'm hoping that will be developed over time. Another way to think about it, and again, this is not particularly libertarian, but the main goal, and you've identified the real problem with the carbon tax and so forth, is that it hits the poorer people first because their energy consumption is a larger percentage of their incomes. And of course, across the world, there are lots of places that do not yet have access to modern forms of energy, and they clearly need to have that. So the possibly one way to do it is to figure out how to make clean energy, we'll just call it that, and I'm going to include nuclear power among those, by the way, and we can talk about that in a minute, cheaper than fossil fuels, and go and move in that particular direction. And one of the ways that you could do that is to incentivize research and development on these particular technologies over time. I mean, the good news is currently both wind and solar are on steep curves where their costs are being reduced dramatically over time. I've seen one analysis. I don't know if viewers have heard this before, but in the United States, the Biden administration wants to make it the case where all of our energy, electric power is generated by clean energy sources by 2035 in the United States. Well, as it turns out, there have been some analysis that basically point out that by 2030, on the current track that we're on in the United States with the reduced costs of wind and solar, that already by 2030, 50%, a little bit more than that, will probably be produced by renewables. Again, we'll have to see how if that plays out, but the focus should be on making energy cheaper for everybody and to make it cheaper than fossil fuels.
Thank you so much. And before we move to the more reform side of this issue, I would like to remind our audience once again that you can ask your questions in the chat box here, and we will refer to them during our live stream. So if you have questions to Ronald Bailey or to Martin, you can ask your questions here, and I'll give it to you, Martin.
Thank you so much, Leila. I think very important thing that you just mentioned, in that capitalism and innovation drives down prices, and it does so just the same for renewables, especially that the green premium that exists for renewable energy has been shifting down, and I've seen with solar energy that the huge increase in capacity and efficiency goes very well with with decreases in costs. And despite that, there is still a sense that we need to subsidize heavily renewable energy. We've seen that in the Inflation Reduction Act. We've seen that all around the world in many policies of many countries to involve that as one of the landmark portions of their environmental policy. And so I wanted to ask you a bit about, we talked a bit about subsidies that have negative effects directly, but how about subsidies that are supposed to lower down the prices of renewables, that are supposed, or for example, electric cars, anything else that has a direct positive effect environmentally, where there isn't that big of an issue of, like with corn. However, there are still negative externalities that are created as part of that, or there just might not be a need for it. So wanted to ask you, what's your take on the subsidies of renewables, of electric vehicles, and of other such initiatives where the government tries to provide some price manipulation that is supposed to serve a better purpose, but might not be necessary or might have negative outcomes.
Well, as a libertarian, my first step, and again, it's a policy. I'm not doing the politics right now. Would simply be get rid of all subsidies for everything. I mean, there's no reason why the market cannot figure out, people acting freely in markets to figure out what is best for them and what sources of energy that they want to use. Um, but there is a question: is right now fossil fuels are incredibly abundant and very cheap. And to the extent that you think that global warming is man-made global warming could become a significant problem during the course of this century, and I do believe that it could, then you might want to take some steps to encouraging people to adopt non-fossil fuel energies. Probably, and again, this is an interference in the market, but probably the most efficient way to do that would not be to subsidize technologies, not to pick technologies like that, but to subsidize to the extent that we're required to do that, and we're thinking about the open access commons of the atmosphere, would be to focus on research and development, to try to find out new chemistries for batteries, new ways to enhance solar energy production. I mean, there are a lot of new chemistries. There's a compound called perovskite, which is much cheaper than silicon, which people are working on. And if you could roll that out, then it would really undercut the electricity that's produced by even natural gas. And another thing to focus on, honestly, is we need to figure out why nuclear power is not being adopted across the world. And again, that's part of the reform agenda that you want to talk about later, I suspect. But the fact of the matter is that there's a wonderful study by an Australian energy researcher. It was published in 2017, where he was looking at what happened to nuclear power and why the cost started increasing massively after the 1970s. And part of that, by the way, was the National Environmental Policy Act in the United States, which focused solely on safety. But he said if the trends had been like the cost trends had continued from the 60s through the early 70s across the world, nuclear power would be cost only 10% of what natural gas costs. Electricity from nuclear power in 2015 would be 1/10 the cost of natural gas. And essentially, he argues, at that price point, if we had lived in that alternative universe where the regulations didn't destroy that prospect, essentially 100% of the world's electricity could be produced using nuclear power. And we have foregone that possibility because we overregulated the technology.
I'm very glad you mentioned nuclear power. It's very much on the top of my mind recently with what is happening in Germany. Yeah.
I'm sorry. I can't believe that the Germans are doing this to themselves. I mean, they've increased their coal use for electricity for the last 10 years. It's madness.
I 100% agree with you. I am a German citizen, and I don't think I've been more ashamed in the recent memory of what is happening there than now. And that is I think the poster child for how just insanity in terms of, like, there's no sane background, the base for what is happening there, and still it is. And so the same thing in Australia that you mentioned, nuclear power is outlawed there. Even though they are one of the biggest uranium producers in the world, you can't have nuclear power plants in Australia. In a country where you can literally put anything in the middle of the country and there is not going to be any impact on anyone, pretty much, but still there are such concerns. And there are two things I wanted to talk with you about that, but um, talking specifically about regulations in this case, and talking about the activism that leads to making, for example, nuclear power, but also other environmental solutions just impossible to do. What can we do to change the minds and also, as a result, change the policies that are behind that, if they are not rooted in facts, but instead they are rooted in a emotional sense of uh, danger from nuclear power, going back as back to Chernobyl and Fukushima and so on, and how can we make this and other solutions viable and something that we can actually get done in such a circumstance.
Well, in the United States, there was some hope, and I think there's still some hope. Is after the Inflation Reduction Act, which is largely an act that is rolling out U.S. environmental policy, renewable energy policy. After that, the Congress was supposed to consider reforms to the National Environmental Policy Act and some other reforms so that it would be possible to build the infrastructure required to get energy supplies from one place to the other in the country, not just renewable power, but that will be required. And there was some hope that they would be able to roll that back. Right now, as you probably know, environmental impact statements in the United States take 4 to 6 years to get done. Then they get challenged in courts by people who don't want anything built near them, and it takes forever to get anything built. There was my colleague at Reason, Eric Boehm, just did a nice article pointing out that an electrical power transmission line from Wyoming to Nevada took 18 years to build. And it's built in the middle of nowhere, literally. But because of so many court cases and environmental impact statements and so forth, it just took that long to be built. And if the environmental community wants to move in the direction of renewable, and I think here's where the politics may come into play. The environmental movement understands that if they want renewable energy, it's going to be generated in places where there are not a lot of cities, either offshore or in the middle of the United States for wind and solar and that kind of thing. And you're going to need a lot of transmission lines to be built across the country in order to get that electricity to the coasts, essentially. And they're simply going to have to, if they're really serious about achieving this goal, they're going to have to compromise with other people in the United States who would like to, for example, use natural gas. The environmental movement has been stymieing the building of natural gas transmission lines throughout the United States. And this is a much lower carbon fuel than coal. And so I think there's a possibility of a compromise where basically some fossil fuel interested folks could compromise with the renewable folks and say, all right, we need to change the regulations so that we can build the infrastructure required to get energy to people, period. And I have some hope that may work.
I'm very glad that you mentioned permitting reform, because it's my personal favorite topic. It's the sexiest of policy topics, I may say, and I think that it's very underappreciated in terms of its impact that it has on the environment, and how decisive of a force it is in a lot of the projects. And definitely we can see that there is a sort of a status quo bias, and always when there is a question of regulations or permitting, they always favor what is already there and what is well known over new things. And because there is such a huge overhaul that needs to happen with energy, with transportation, with urban planning, with everything pretty much that concerns our everyday lives, permitting that was, again, well intentioned, because it came out of the very early environmental movement to protect, against companies spilling chemicals into the water and building a coal power plant in the middle of a national park and so on, which wouldn't happen. But again, now they are standing in the way. And I think there is a lot of room, as you also mentioned, for alignment and building alliances there between the different sides of the discussion, just because this is something that we can all realize that this is standing in the way. And how can we, on one side, so building on from there, how can we make sure that there isn't going to be reasons to fear that we are just going to get rid of all the regulations and then suddenly we are going to get back to the 60s, Erin Brockovich kind of
Right.
situation, but instead eliminate the barriers and focus on, hey, now we can do this stuff, now we can make it more competitive, now we can actually get building, without fearing that um, the drug, the medicine is going to be worse than the disease.
My hope is that the people in the environmental community who are in favor of renewable power will realize that the regulations that they used to stymie the build out of other kinds of infrastructure they didn't want are now stopping them, and that they will realize that they must compromise politically with other producers of energy, with other people who are building infrastructure across the country. Um, I you hear inklings of this so far in the United States, but it's going to be a long slog. As you may have heard, politics in the United States are quite polarized nowadays and quite tribalistic, and members of each tribe on the left and the right don't want to appear to be consorting with the enemy. So it's going to be a problem. But I'm hoping at the end of the day that realism will strike them, that you're simply not, for example, those people who are in favor of building out solar and wind, they have to recognize that they cannot do it unless they agree with other people who want to build other sorts of infrastructure. One of the other examples that you should be mentioned is just exactly how pernicious these regulations have been with regard to environmental goods. Two examples, and I think that you all supplied those in the links to this conversation. Basically, New York City for years has been trying to get a congestion fee for downtown New York, and if you've been in downtown New York, you know how crowded it can be. And the idea is to encourage people to use other modes of transportation rather than their cars to get into the gridlock downtown. And congestion fees have worked in other places quite successfully, London, for example. And it took, because the environmental impact statements were constantly being updated and challenged and so forth, it took forever to get that environmental good, if you will, a pollution reducing good, adopted. And the environmental community should be aware that their support of these regulations actually got in the way of something they would desire. And then, of course, there's the famous case of the giant windmill farm off of the coast of Massachusetts, it took, I don't know, 12 years of environmental impact statements and so forth until finally the project died. And it was being opposed by, among other people, the liberal line of the Senate, Senator Kennedy, because he didn't want his view ruined by windmills as he looked out from Hyannisport. I realize that that's tendentious and mean, but the fact of the matter is, again, this would have been a renewable project that should have been supported by the folks who regard themselves as conventional environmentalists, and instead the regulations stopped that. And in fact, right now, and my colleague Eric Boehm has also written a wonderful article pointing out that there are nine, what is it, 9,000 megawatts, or maybe even bigger than that, worth of renewable projects that are simply not being built because of environmental impact statements right now that they're facing. It's basically stymieing what people on the environmental left would think is their agenda. And I'm not sure they understand it yet, but I suspect they'll come to in the next few years. And I'm hoping for a lot of compromise in that regard.
Very good points. And I love that you mentioned the case of the congestion pricing, because I also think that it's a best case of how the status quo bias, basically. It's we need more research, we need more environmental analysis before we can start saving the environment.
Right.
And which makes no sense, because you are actively destroying the environment in the process if you don't introduce that. And with what you mentioned at the end, there's currently 8,000 renewables projects in the US in the pipeline that can't get through the environmental, the NEPA and other permitting.
Right.
And because of that, it's just waiting, it's not being done. And then we sit down and look at the charts and still like, why are we still getting so much energy from coal? Well, that's why, because it's already there. They didn't have to go through any of this permitting process. It was built, it's there. And the same thing with roads. It's much easier to build a highway than to build a railroad or anything that is going to be more environmentally friendly. We see that everywhere all across the country.
Well, one of my favorite examples on the railroad, if I may mention it,
Mhm.
is supposedly California is building a high-speed railroad from Los Angeles to San Francisco. And the environmental permitting process was supposed to cost something like $20 billion. It's already $100 billion. And the part of the railroad they built is in the middle of nowhere, the Central Valley of California, nowhere near LA or San Francisco. And it's all because of these permitting problems. It's complete madness. I don't think we need to build that railroad in any case. But the fact is that because of the regulations that are supported by a lot of the environmental community, conventional environmental community, because I think of myself as an environmentalist, they're killing off projects that they were in favor of.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, California HSR, great example. So I checked. Currently, it has been reviewed up to Palmdale. So it's still like 100 miles before LA that they just can't build because it hasn't been approved, and because the money is still flowing, money is still being wasted, taxpayer money at that. And you can't even prove that that's a viable project because it's not right now. It makes no sense to have a train that currently would, in best case scenario, run from San Francisco to the middle of nowhere in South California. There's no point. And I think there is a bit of a sentiment that is troubling for me as a YIMBY on the left, that there is a sense that we can basically, the time for getting stuff done will be after the revolution, for example, will be after we break the shackles, will be after we already overturned capitalism.
Yeah.
And we can't do stuff with the market because it's not their role. And so we are going to block the markets from solving the issues because it's not consistent with our ideological proposition. And how can that be addressed in a way that, because it's not really an argument that is rooted in reality, it's rooted in feelings. And so how can we show in a more, for example, more also emotional way, I guess, and to some extent, because we can't just go pragmatic fully on this. How can we show that, hey, what you're doing has real negative consequences, as we can see with Energiewende in Germany, which I think will go down as in the next 50 years as the worst environmental policy in the history of the planet. How can we show that this is the way to go, that markets have a role to play, that markets need to be allowed to do this, and even the governments in this case need to be allowed to do this because they are blocking themselves effectively as well.
Right. Well, at a more general level, and I think you all have that data available as well, is that if you're looking at environmental index quality scores across the world, there's a wonderful study which basically points out that the country, there's a, I believe it's Freedom House that ranks countries from free to partly free to not free and so forth. And what you can see is that the countries that are ranked as free have the highest environmental quality scores, highest environmental index quality scores, and the country have the lowest. And so obviously, and among the things that make a country free is the access to free markets and to capital markets and that kind of thing. So you obviously can make that point to people is if you want to go to a place that has a cleaner environment, cleaner air, cleaner rivers, that kind of thing, or improving, they're not always perfect, but they're improving, is that you're going to the countries that are largely free market countries. And generally, the freer the market, the cleaner the natural environment is. Another thing that goes along with that is those countries that have free markets, and this is just a wonderful environmental good and very easily demonstrable, is that those are the countries where the forests are coming back, for example. Europe has had a huge resurgence in natural forests over the last 50 years or so, as has North America, those kind of places. And again, it's related to the fact that they become prosperous societies and people are now willing to make trade-offs for environmental goods. And so the more you can encourage, if you will, free markets and honest bureaucracies and private property, the more likely you're going to end up with a cleaner environment that you will enjoy, and one where nature is going to be expanding as opposed to contracting.
Thank you very much, dear Ronald. I think we should call it a day. And thank you, Martin, for. I think actually, sorry for it, but this. The Green Liberty campaign, as we're running for April and we will run for throughout the year, I think it's very important for just like uniting people who care about the environment, which should be basically all of us, with the liberty loving societies and people, which is a good thing to just realize that they are not on the other side of the street of people. You know, these can actually go together, and there's a potential in that. But we have to actually take a step into making people realize that potential. So with that, I would also like to thank our audience. I see that we're pretty diverse today. We're very we have people joining us from all around the world, which is very happy on our side. And I would like to take this chance to promote our upcoming events as well. We will actually have one more Green Liberty Live, which I'm expecting all of you to join with more questions and more brainstorming on green liberty and free market environmentalism. Our guest will be Benji Backer, who is the president of the American Conservation Coalition and host of the Coming Clean podcast. We will have this live on Tuesday, May 9 at 1 p.m. Eastern Time, right here with Students for Liberty. And one last quick note before we wrap it up. The largest pro-liberty gathering in Europe is happening this weekend. It's coming to Lisbon on April 22nd. So if you happen to be around, maybe you're in Portugal or somewhere around Europe, make sure that you join, because absolutely, it's going to be absolutely amazing. The program will include keynote talks, panel discussions. It's going to be all about liberty. You can visit our website, libertycon.net, for all the details. Once again, thank you both. Thanks to both of you, and we'll see each other very soon again.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.